Hi there. This is Mark Herbst, Associate Superintendent at Student Support Services, and I'm back again trying for my second screencast. I did the PBIS one and decided to do another one that's near and dear to my heart. That's the concept of inclusion of students with disabilities. So the title of the presentation is Understanding Goal 1.6, and I'm talking about District Goal 1.6. It's basically the road to increasing inclusive practices in Modesto City Schools. So I appreciate you taking the time to tune into this, and I kind of want to explain what's in store. General housekeeping items. First off, you guys are taking this for a reason. Either A, number one, you're trying to complete your 0.5 for your professional development, or you're wanting to take advantage of the great summer PD offerings that are being offered, and this is one of them. So either way, in order to get through, you need to listen to the entire screencast, and then you need to complete practicum. I'm going to probably be talking at you for about 30 to 40, maybe 45 minutes tops. And then for the last hour and a half, you need to complete these two activities. So embedded, assuming that Mr. Rich can do this for me, but embedded, you should see a link that's going to be Extending Inclusive Opportunities, which is an article. I want you to read that article, and then you're going to write a one-page reflection on the benefits and challenges to inclusion. That one page should be double-spaced. Well, it should have your name. Should be double-spaced, and it should be no greater than a 12-point font. From there, that should take you maybe a half hour tops. I just want you to write me a one-page reflection on your thoughts on the screencast and your thoughts on inclusion. I will tell you, there's people that feel very, very strongly about this topic, and I don't want teachers, administrators, or classified staff to. I want to get to really what you feel about it, what the barriers could be, what the benefits to it are, your experience, etc. And again, that's going to follow the same format: one page, double-spaced, 12-point font. Once you finish that, you're going to email those documents to me, and then I'm going to review them, and then I will give you credit, and I'll send a reply to you that's going to include somebody from the CNI PD department that basically says you've completed the hours, and therefore you should get 2 hours credit either toward the hourly rate, if it's summer school, or if it's summer PD, or the 0.5, either or. So that's how that's going to work. Moving right along. Want to talk about the objectives that we have. First off, I'm going to identify some of the core entitlements for students with disabilities. I want to kind of look at the history in terms of where we've come from and where we're at now and what led to it. I want to evaluate a landmark Ninth Circuit case that addresses inclusion of students with disabilities, including somebody with severe disabilities. I want to talk about what supplemental supports are and how they benefit the disabled in a classroom setting. I want to look at grading requirements for students with disabilities. I think that there's a lot of misnomers out there on this topic, and I want to kind of provide some clarification on that. And then I want to look at like what do I think it's going to take to get us to where we need to be based on the district goal as it pertains to inclusion. So that's pretty much what I've got. I want to go into a little bit just in terms of the history. I think it's important to note that despite the fact some would argue that we haven't moved very fast, really when you look at the timeline of public education and students with disabilities, actually we in many ways we should be proud of some of the stuff that's happened. I mean, and I don't mean proud like we've done the disabled any favor, but we have come a long way in a relatively short amount of time. Prior to 1975, students with disabilities, especially those with severe disabilities, honestly, they rarely attended school. Some were, or many were institutionalized. They were thought of that they didn't have the right to attend school. They couldn't benefit from education, so they were truly isolated in their education. In 1975, we got the Education for All Act, and that changed all that. It basically outlined that students with disabilities shall have the same opportunity as their non-disabled peers. So that was a big landmark in terms of getting kids with disabilities on a public school campus. That being said, we were still a long way from even where we're at today. A lot of times those kids were isolated. They didn't attend for the entire day. Their access wasn't the same as their non-disabled peers, but in any event, a landmark Education Act. The Individuals with Disability Education Act that came out in 1990 came out with really two hallmark pieces of special education legislation, so to speak, and then the legalities that follow it. It basically said that any child with a disability is entitled to an individualized education program, an IEP, that is designed and must provide a student with a free, appropriate public education. And that's one of the more heavily litigated areas of special education. It's a topic that is near and dear to me also, but one that I won't get into too much today. It also introduced the concept of the least restrictive environment. And I've got a slide that I'm going to share with you on the next, it's actually the next slide regarding that topic. But again, that was a groundbreaking authorization back in 1990. The No Child Left Behind Act, well, actually, I take that back. The IEP came before 1990, but FAPE and the LRE was outlined in IDA 1990. No Child Left Behind was also significant, and it was significant for this fact. Special education, students with disabilities became a significant subgroup in their progress tracked. And that was huge because in the past, students with disabilities didn't take statewide assessments. How they scored or what they scored, etc., was not relevant. And with NCLB, not only was it relevant, but a lot of districts, including ours, received penalties, so to speak, because students with disabilities weren't making adequate progress. So I'm sure if you're familiar with the Act, there's No Child Left Behind. There's a lot of criticisms and critiques, but I will tell you, it did make students with disabilities a significant subgroup. And again, that was big in terms of where we're at today, because we continue to chart the progress of those of our kids with disabilities, both moderate, severe, and mild moderate. I want to go into LRE, and this goes back to what came out in 1990, but the least restrictive environment is defined by the Individuals with Disability Education Act. And I want to read through this, and I really, really want to talk about what this means. It says, the IDA requires that to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions or other care facilities, are educated with children who are not disabled, and special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from regular education environment occurs only when the nature or severity of the disability of a child is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and supports and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So really, that's big, and it's big in a lot of different ways. First off, it's basically stating that all kids with disabilities, regardless of the severity, should be placed to the greatest extent appropriate in general education. And it kind of hints at where a child may not be appropriate. And that says only when the nature and the severity of the disability is such that you can't educate them without the use of supplemental aids, services, and supplemental aids and services. Now, some of you may not know what a supplemental aid and service is. Could be a lot of things. Could be the service of support in a classroom. Could be paraprofessional support. It could be assistive technology support. It could be accommodations and modifications. So it's basically stating that we need to make sure that we utilize that prior to removing a child from the general education environment. And that's big. That's real big. In Modesto City Schools, and the reason why, and I want to say all the stuff that I'm going to talk about today, I'll use Modesto City Schools as a reference, but I will tell you that there's issues up and down the state of California. And that's because in the state of California, we're currently being monitored by the federal government for unusually high numbers of students with disabilities who are in self-contained classes. So in Modesto City Schools, we've got a lot of self-contained classes. We've got self-contained classes for students with severe handicaps, intellectual disabilities, medically fragile students with also significant intellectual disabilities, students for special day classes for children with behavioral and emotional needs, as well as self-contained classes for students with just learning disabilities, our learning handicap classes, students that have traditionally mild, moderate disabilities, which I'll explain. And that whole conglomeration of how we do business in California has piqued the interest of the federal government, hence why they're cracking down on our state to make sure that we change our culture and our practices. Currently, the California Department of Education is monitoring MCS for that very reason. I want to point out that in some of you guys who live in perhaps a different state or came from perhaps a different region of California or maybe a different district outside the valley may have indeed had a very, very different experience with inclusion and or how students with disabilities access general education. I will tell you truthfully, the valley culture is particularly bad. San Joaquin, Stanislaus County, Merced, Fresno, we have a rich tradition of self-contained classes. And if I had more time, I'd go into this, but I think it's important to note, oftentimes our frame of reference on what we believe is shaped by our experience. And what that means is, if I was a teacher in Oregon, and in Oregon they supported and inclusion was the way I learned how to do business in my credentialing program, and that's what the schools did, odds are I would have a view that, oh my goodness, why are we removing these kids and putting them in special day classes? Here in California, and especially in the Valley and in Modesto City schools, we have a culture of doing that, which therefore makes the culture difficult to shift. In many cases, teachers, administrators, they are used to seeing, hey, wait a second, these kids don't belong here, they belong here, and we look for reasons to put them there. And I think that that's part of the challenges and one of the things we have to overcome. Moving along, now would be a time I'm going to ask you and then pause for a quick reflection, but what are the benefits when students with disabilities are included in general education, and what are the challenges? So I'll give you a second to think about that, and then I'll come back in and share mine. All right, so coming back, well, if I had more time, I'd include a bunch of slides because there's tremendous benefits to the inclusion of students in a general education setting. Couple big ones. We've got some great special educators out there, but to be honest with you, and I'll give you an example, I thought of myself as a pretty good teacher. My degree is in social science, yet I taught my kids with disabilities mild, moderate mathematics. And I will tell you, I am far from a mathematics expert. However, I still experienced some success. The benefit is that students get access to a teacher that's credentialed to teach them. Okay, so it's beneficial that way, and just in terms of potentially their overall learning experience. Kids also get numerous social benefits from being included. And to be honest with you, I think when we pull them out, we send a bad message to kids that basically, hey, this is for a group of kids, the other group doesn't belong here. So that's definitely one of the negative parts, but the benefit is the social experience that a child gets. I would also venture to say, even on a moderate severe, the benefit is the idea of we do become more aware and more tolerant, more understanding of kids with differences. That's another tremendous benefit. There are numerous challenges. Teacher preparation, I'll be the first to tell you, I do not believe our teacher preparation program does well. I mean, I know that there's been some emphasis on differentiation of late and how to make adjustments for students of second language and or students with disabilities, but I will tell you, teacher preparation is a challenge. Time and resources are a challenge. I believe that teachers have a tremendously challenging job, and finding the time and or to familiarize yourself on your own or getting to know the intricacies of a child can be a challenge. Yeah, we definitely have some work cut out. I would probably say the last big challenge would be the culture. Again, changing a culture in a district like Modesto City Schools or in the Valley is always a challenge. That being said, I will be honest with you, I'm pleased with what the district has done overall, the changes that have happened in the classroom. We are making steady growth, but on the flip end of it, it's definitely a challenge to change people's mindset. I want to give you guys just a little bit of info because I kind of want to separate moderate to severe disabilities and mild moderate. And so a couple different things that I think a layperson would need to know about special education is there's 13 handicapping conditions. And there's no discrimination between severe and non-severe disabilities. However, we tend to categorize in the sunny state of California based on them. So I want to give you some examples of severe disabilities. That includes intellectual disabilities, deaf, blind, deaf, hard of hearing, visually impaired, severe orthopedic impairments, traumatic brain injury, Autism, even though autism is a spectrum disorder, it's seen as a severe disability, and students with emotional disturbance is also seen as severe. And I would say generally take autism out of there, where you might have some students with Asperger's or high functioning autism. Generally speaking, the majority of this group of kids are typically in a special day class when one could be provided, at least in the state of California. Then you have some non-severe examples. And non-severe examples are typically the ones that you can't necessarily see, so to speak. Speech and language impairment, specific learning disability, which we're going to go into in great detail, and other health impairment. And generally speaking, these three are usually served in a general education environment, with resource support, or in some cases, believe it or not, still pulled out and placed into a special day class. And here we call those special day class for learning handicapped, at least in our district. Trying to change that title, but that's what they're called. All of those handicapping conditions have their own eligibility criteria. Each one of them requires a 3-year evaluation to redetermine eligibility. So it's basically meaning that, hey, and this may sound silly, a child with intellectual disabilities has got to probably be eligible for their entire life. But there's actually an expectation that students with mild to moderate disabilities hopefully exit themselves from special education. But anyway, qualifications for special education, got to have one of the 13 handicapping conditions, any of them. You got to meet eligibility as determined by state criteria, and all 13 have their unique eligibility. You must require specially designed instruction, meaning you must be in need of special education. And that doesn't mean a special day class. It just means something unique that needs to be provided to you that isn't provided to anybody else based on your entitlement. I want to talk about specific learning disabilities, and the reason why is that's the most prevalent handicapping condition, not only in Modesto City schools, but across the nation. And some examples of specific learning disabilities are dyslexia, whichever you hear about, which is typically you're going to see somebody who struggles in the area of reading, especially basic reading and spelling. Auditory processing is a learning disability. Visual processing is a learning disability. Sensory processing is a learning disability. And how we define this, and this may be an aha to some of our practitioners out there, is SLD kids, specific learning disability kids, typically have average to above average intelligence. So with 100 being the absolute average on an IQ, that means a large chunk of the kids that are receiving special education services have IQs at least in the average range. That's in between 90 to 110. And in some cases above that. So you have kids that have the cognitive ability to do grade level work, and in some cases exceed grade level work. What makes them unique, though, is that they're well below expected age and grade norms as it pertains to their academic achievement levels. And a specific learning disabled kid may have difficulties in reading, maybe mathematics, maybe writing, maybe, I'll just stop at those, or a combination of all three of those. And the reason why they have that, it's directly tied back to their processing disorder, their auditory processing, their visual processing. That's why their achievement is so low. Then they require, as I said before, special education services. I kind of want to talk about, when I do presentations, I like to get into this a little bit more. So I'm going to try to make it a little bit faster, but I also want to make a point. And I want you to kind of imagine the experience of a child at the early levels going through elementary school and being found eligible as a child with a specific learning disability. And you could look at it not only from the kid's standpoint, but also the parent standpoint on the other side. So I've been fortunate. I have two wonderful kids who have done well academically, and they were able to achieve at or above grade level throughout their elementary experience. A child with a specific learning disability, that isn't in the cards for them. So they begin experiencing difficulties as soon as we begin putting tasks in their way. And it's typically introductory reading skills, phonemic awareness, things like that. That's especially dyslexic. That's where you're going to see some struggles. they begin to struggle and notice that they're behind. So as other students begin reading, they are the ones that are laboring through the process, struggling, etc. So you can imagine A, the embarrassment that that child probably feels, and B, the disappointment that the parent probably feels knowing that they have a child that isn't able to keep up with their peers. So eventually, that child ends up pulling that discrepancy that we talked about on the specific learning disability, and we begin providing them special education. And so in many ways, that comes as a pull-out program. So now not only are you embarrassed, but hey, instead of sitting in here with the rest of the class, now there's a handful of kids that get pulled out of that class and go to the resource room. And in elementary school, they tend to be pretty tolerant of kids. I don't think that they necessarily catch on to the stigma, but believe me, as they start going through into intermediate grades, etc., the stigma starts to become more prevalent. B, so much is shaped by the experience that those kids have in their classroom when they're in there with the kids. So some may respond and they may have a teacher who's incredibly supportive. Hey, I'm going to get you through this. I'm not going to put you in situations where it's going to embarrass you. I'm going to look for opportunities to highlight your strengths as a child rather than emphasize the weakness, etc. And that's typically where we see great experiences for our kids at any grade level, but definitely in the elementary and in the secondary. But oftentimes that's not necessarily what happens. Students start to get a bad taste in terms of what their classroom experience is like. They feel defeated. They feel like there's no hope for them. They feel like they can't keep up. And that really emphasizes the role of the teacher. B, it's kind of like, you got to look at it from this perspective. And this is, I want to kind of challenge the secondary people out there, because a lot of times we hear this, these kids are just lazy. They have the opportunity. They are not the opportunity. They're just lazy. They don't want to work. Well, number one, they may not understand how to do the work, for one. So it's difficult to do it if you don't understand it. B, how do you respond when put in situations to where you're asked to do something you're not good at? And I'll give you an example. I am absolutely horrible at working on an automobile. I have atrocious visual memory. I'm spatially challenged. It does not make sense to me. It is frustrating for me. I don't like it. I never ever want to do it. I have absolutely zero skills. So I'm lucky enough to be able to be in a situation where I can pay to have people do that work for me. It helps me out because that's an area of definite weakness for me. The funny thing with kids, and again, this doesn't mean that we still don't need to put these activities in front of them, but their challenge, they may be great at doing the things I don't like to do, which is working on cars, which we don't teach in public education generally, except if it's an auto shop class at the secondary level. But we put them in situations to where they're forced to attempt to or work through the part that they struggle with the most day in and day out. So you can imagine the wear and tear that could have on a kid in terms of continually being bombarded in the area that they struggle. So you might ask, well, geez, how does a learning disabled student struggle? Well, first off, one of the things that we do is we pile on homework rather than focus on mastery of a standard. And I know teachers, you may say, well, geez, they need that homework to master the standard. And I think that that's a different story. But I will tell you from my experience as a teacher, I gave homework and a lot of it. And I will tell you in hindsight, I wish that I wouldn't have to the level I did, just because I think I had my kids who struggled relying on, well, first off, I put something, if they didn't have support at home, they weren't doing it. Another thing you need to know is that learning disabled students, there's genetics involved to it. So if I go home and let's say I'm a dyslexic, my mom's a dyslexic, there's going to be virtually zero support for me when I go home to try to get that homework done. That reteaching that exists in some of our class or in some of our homes isn't going to happen. And B, I would point out truthfully, if you look at the research on homework, but also just even the stuff that we learn in teacher preparation, we aren't supposed to assign homework that requires kids to have to if they can't do it in a classroom, they shouldn't be doing it at home. If we send it home, we're basically insisting that a parent is going to be there to be able to pick up some of those pieces. So and that does our learning disabled kids absolutely no favors. This is a great little quote that came out of, I want to say, University of Iowa. And this is somebody who taught second grade in an inclusive school. And it basically, the point I want to make as you read through this, and I'm not going to read this through you, is the power of the perception of a teacher. Okay. I cannot stress, and I'm going to highlight this at the end of this screencast, the role and mindset that a teacher has on the success of a child in their classroom. And I'm going to speak that goes beyond students with disabilities. That goes with English language learners, etc. When a teacher has the right mindset, when a teacher views a child as a child, and when a teacher views the fact that they can have an impact on them through support, guidance, and mentorship, and I mean mentorship through academic tasks, that kid's going to be successful. And this kind of quote just highlights something. And it also is a phrase that I'll touch on a little bit later. All children are general education students first. You have to remember that. I think we're guilty of labeling kids. We label kids SPED kids. That's a kid with autism. Really, guys, it's a child. The child has a disability, which is autism, but the child isn't an autistic kid. Same thing with how we view the disabled. SPED students. Hold on. Sorry about that. I'm doing this screencast on a Sunday, and my telephone was ringing, so I just shut that thing off. But anyway, the proper mindset and the ability to support really is what makes our kids successful. And that's any kid, especially any kid that experiences any type of challenge. A couple different facts I want to share with you. Minority students and students living in poverty are overrepresented in high incidence categories. By high incidence, that means categories like specific learning disabled, speech and language, and other health impaired. Students in special education are more likely to be African American and Latino as compared to Asian American and whites. So, here I ask, what does those facts mean to you? Does poverty equate to disability, and does a student's race or language acquisition status have any impact? And guys, I will tell you it shouldn't. The point behind this is let's say 2% let's say blindness affects 2% of the population. You would expect then that 2% of whites, 2% of Hispanics, 2% of African Americans, etc., are all blind. And again, that's an inflated figure, but I just want to use it for a frame of reference. What this slide means is that individuals who live in poverty and minority students are over-identified in high incidence categories like specific learning disabilities. And the reason why we talk about students' race and language acquisition is we should also, and now I'll take more of a global stance on this, and this is more of a legitimate percentage. Generally speaking, 10% of the population is going to have a disability. And so what makes that unique in Modesto City Schools as an example is we should have 10% of our population, we have, last time I looked, which is about a year ago, I want to say it was 26% of English language learners in special education. So that indicates a 16 percentage point swing, which should not exist. Should be 10% across the board, even for English language learners, which means we tend to over-identify students, and it's not necessarily because of a disability, it's because of language acquisition. A couple other things that you should know: students with disabilities are a protected class. And so as soon as we, in public education, label a child or find them eligible as a child with a disability, it throws them into a protected class. And when you're put into a protected class, that means that you're entitled to numerous procedural safeguards, and there's an expectation that we provide kids the free appropriate public education and all the supports and services necessary for them to achieve so. As I said before, general education students first, SPED students they receive a special education service. So we don't define them as SPED students, we define them as general education who also require special education services. Some disabilities are evident by sight, some that are not, and I'll talk about that a little later. There's no changes or distinction in special education law based on the severity of a disability. So even going back to the least restrictive environment, it says all kids, unless the nature and severity of the disability is such that you can't educate them in a general ed environment. There is no distinction that says, hey, it's okay to not educate this group there, even though we do a good job, or I can't say I use that good job not in a true way, but in more of a tongue-in-cheek way. A good job of compartmentalizing, meaning if I'm an intellectually disabled kid, the chances of me going into general education are very, very slim in Modesto City Schools and in the Valley. And again, as I touched on before, an eligible kid, their parents are entitled to a number of procedural safeguards. So most have heard of inclusion and mainstreaming, but there are distinct differences. And I don't want to get into it from a semantic standpoint, but I first want to explain kind of the difference because, well, let me get to it. I think it'll make a little bit more sense. Let's look at mainstreaming first. So mainstreaming, I'm not suggesting it's a negative thing. It has a different connotation based on the underlying assumption behind it. So a definition of mainstreaming is it's a selective placement of special education students in one or more general education classes. And that's in many, many ways a good thing. Hey, you know what? Instead of being in a special day class, this kid is coming out for one or two classes, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of times we pat ourselves on the back for that. And in some cases, it truly should be celebrated. But the negative part about it is mainstreaming assumes that the kid is in special ed, meaning they're receiving the majority of their service in a special education classroom. So the assumption is, hey, this kid has earned the opportunity to be placed in regular classes by demonstrating the ability to keep up with the work assigned by the regular classroom teacher. And I'll tell you, that's probably a mindset that's very, very, very prevalent here in Modesto City Schools and in the Valley. I will tell you, that's not the way it's supposed to be. We shouldn't be generating placement based on a kid or a child with disabilities opportunity to keep up with the general education students. And what I mean by that is once we found that kid eligible, we recognize that he wasn't going to be able to keep up. He's got a disability. That's why you've got to provide the IEP and the structure and supports involved in there. It's now on us, including general education teachers with support, to be able to honor the LRE part of keeping that child in a general education classroom to the greatest extent possible. It's not about, hey, you have this now with the help out there, you need to keep up. It shouldn't be like that, even though there are kids that have IEPs that can keep up. Inclusion is a little bit different. Inclusion starts with the idea that we may have to pull a child out, but we're gonna do our best to keep them in general education right from the get-go. And so you're gonna see that's an express commitment to educate each child to the maximum extent appropriate in the school and classroom he or she would otherwise attend. The underlying assumption there is support services come to the child rather than as being removed to the greatest extent possible. Also, it requires that only that the child will benefit from being in class, meaning they don't have to keep up with everybody else. And guys, as I said before, there's numerous benefits to being in class. And I want to point out one hallmark case here. It's an interesting one, but I want to kind of put it in reference because I've kind of talked about moderate severe disabilities and mild moderate disabilities. In MCS, we have a tough time in some cases even having students with mild moderate disabilities in general education, hence our learning handicap special day classes. Well, in Sacramento City, there's a child with a disability named Rachel Holland, and it's a Ninth Circuit decision, oftentimes quoted in issues regarding least restrictive environment and due process hearings, you know, the court cases that surround special education. But it's basically a student with a severe disability who attended Sacramento City's school district. Their family pushed for the child to be educated in general education. Sac City continued to want to move into a special day class, I want to say, for students with severe handicaps, and it might have even been at a specialized location if memory serves. Either way, the parents filed for a due process hearing, and it was a relatively lengthy hearing to where they talked about the benefits that Rachel was getting from being in a general education setting. And it's important to note, this wasn't a dyslexic who maybe had a third grade reading level in a high school class. This was a child with severe intellectual disabilities with an IQ of 44. So she was profoundly intellectually disabled. And what the judge found is that, you know what? Rachel Holland could benefit from a general education program. In fact, she was benefiting from the interaction she had with her peers. She was working on a modified curriculum and making progress toward her IEP goals. And yes, she did have assistance of a paraprofessional in that environment, but they were working on that, and she was participating and engaging with students that were her general education peers. Long story short, they found that Rachel Holland was appropriately served in general education, even with the intelligent quotient of a 44. And again, this case, if ever you have time to look at it, really is it's a tribute to factors on when we look to remove children from general education, and it kind of outlined 5 factors that I won't go into now. But it's also just demonstrates the fact that in some cases we struggle with mild moderate disabilities, and yet here's a kid with a severe disability who is able to benefit from a general education placement. I want to go in, I talked about kind of supplemental aids and services, but I want to give an idea of the differences between accommodations and modifications. I want to do that because they oftentimes get mixed. So an accommodation is something that's put in place for a child, but it doesn't change how a student learns the material. They're still required to learn the same material. So an example of that would be extra time. Meaning if I assign my class 15 problems, but I assign the child with the disability the same 15 problems and give him longer time to complete it, that's an example of an accommodation. There's many others. And children with IEPs are entitled to accommodations, but they're also entitled to modifications, and that's something that we don't do very often. Modifications change what a student is taught or expected to learn. So an example of this could be alternative assignments that does not address a standard, or even modifying assignments that do address a standard. And I know, I know this happens more often at the elementary. Secondary teachers seem to get a little bit more jawed up about the idea, but I'll tell you guys, a kid with a disability is entitled to this. Meaning we're not supposed to remove kids from general ed with only accommodations. If we can keep them in general ed through the use of modifications, that's what we're supposed to do based on the LRE provision. Okay. And again, that's a big, not a big shift for everybody. We got teachers that do this all the time, but in some cases, teachers can become very, very resistant to this, which they shouldn't. So here, I teach a 10th grade CP English class. I have students who read at the 3rd grade level. What could possibly be done to support these students, or I said these students in my general education classes? Is this fair to the rest of my class? Guys, it's not about what's equal for students with disabilities. It's equity for that group. And I want to remind you that it's a protected class. The IEP acknowledges that they will not be able to, or that odds are, depending on their disability, they're not going to be able to do the same things that a general education student may be able to do, which is understandable. That's why they have that IEP and that protection. So what could be done for a kid in this? Well, I'll tell you, if I'm a dyslexic who's reading at the 3rd grade level, if you go back to how I defined a child with a specific learning disability, they've got the cognitive ability of just about everybody else sitting around them. They've got IQ in the average to above average range. So perhaps books on, well, no longer books on CD, audio presentation, chunking of material, study buddy, a study pal who reads the material to the child, whatever it would take, those kids should still be able to comprehend the information when it's read to them. Is it fair to the rest of my class? Guys, it's not about what's fair for each individual kid. It's providing them equal access to it. We shouldn't judge it on that. Think about a child in a wheelchair. Do we ask them to run a mile without assistance? Is that different from a child with dyslexia? We do this all the time. Hey, we recognize that the child in the wheelchair doesn't need to. Let's say the standard were to run a 10-minute mile for physical education. We don't ask kids with orthopedic impairments to do that. We recognize it and realize that they're not going to be able to. Maybe the child can, with an orthopedically run it in 12 minutes. So that's great. Then they should be graded and recognized for them being able to meet that goal. The problem with dyslexia or some of those other mild moderate disabilities is we can't see them. So therefore we mask it as laziness. We say, oh goodness, they just need to try harder. We don't do what we can to, we don't recognize and treat them in the way that they need to be treated based on the fact that we can't see their disability. Grading, this comes straight from law. Teacher may use a differential grading system for a student with a disability as long as the IEP team agrees to adopt such a system. So yes, we can grade differently for our kids with IEPs as long as it's determined and it's outlined in the IEP. Consequently, if a student's receiving accommodations, a teacher can't lower the grade simply because the student requires extra time. Okay. It's expected based on their eligibility that if necessary, we make adjustments to students' grading. Not all students with IEPs require differential grading or modifications, but there are a number that do. And it's usually when we start needing to modify, when we start trying to place kids in those special day classes, including the learning handicap class. Student still has the right to what the general education students receive. Believe it or not, yeah, they still have a right to the same curriculum regardless of their setting, or the same themes of the curriculum. By making adjustments to your grading, believe it or not, or adjusting homework, I believe not only will you make your students with disabilities give them greater access, but you're also going to give greater access to some of those students that struggle as well. Is it fair? How am I supposed to notate that I've changed my grading practices? Well, I kind of already addressed the is it fair. How do you notate that in your grading practices? K6 teacher, standard-based report card. I want to say it says IEP differential grading on there, differential standards on that piece. There's a box on the standard-based report card. Grades 7 through 12, that's one of the comments. As soon as you click that, that recognizes that I'm grading kid on a differential standard as compared to the general education peers. But Mark, I'm a high school teacher and I have a student with a severe handicap included in my CP English class. Students working on an alternative curriculum, so obviously they're not you working out of the same grade book. They're probably doing different activities, probably under the supervision and guidance of either PALs or paras. Do they receive credit for passing my CP English class? Well, from a grading standpoint, we should have outlined how they were graded in the IEP, so it would be possible for them to earn an A on their report card. However, on the transcript, it would not reflect CP English class. For students with NonSevere Disabilities, we would put down either the applied or the functional English class, but they would still receive a report card that shows CP English, but a transcript grade that does not reflect that. When inclusion goes right, guys, general and special education work together as partners. They rely on one another. They value each other's expertise. They capitalize on each other's strengths. Service providers, whether or not it's push in or pull out, provide high quality assistance to all students with the desire of getting students that might be removed back in general education as soon as they can. We don't have a SPED label for programs and kids. SPED label is no longer prevalent. They're kids. They receive a service, but we no longer have that culture of a SPED kid or a certain disability goes to a certain place. Students feel that they can be successful regardless of their ability level. Assistive technology like audio presentation, calculators, various pencil grips, you name it. I mean, there's a whole slew of assistive technology that can help students be successful. Assignments and assessment are differentiated to support student learning, and that's key. That's important. So how do we get there? When inclusion goes wrong? Students are placed in general ed without assistance and general education teachers, that happens. If anybody listens to this that has had a poor experience, I could tell you it's difficult to overcome that. And typically when we do things wrong, it's because we've placed somebody in there and have not put up the necessary structures and supports and or professional development or training on what that child needs and what the general education teacher's role is. Sometimes we see that the general ed teachers don't recognize their role as being the primary teacher, and I usually see this with children with autism that are included in general education, typically students with Asperger's. Let's say that they may have a paraprofessional who needs assistance with prompting. However, their academics are close to grade level, if not at grade level. What oftentimes you see is the paraprofessional, in essence, becoming the teacher and working with the kid individually. Questions that the child may have on assignments are answered by the para rather than the classroom teacher, and that could become problematic. Sometimes the special education teacher in a co-teaching model is seen as the glorified para, to where, hey, you're kind of here, you're kind of lurking in the back, and you turn off the lights, stuff like that. It should be better than that. And there's just a general lack of trust between general and special education, and that leads to division, and in some cases, some situations that are difficult to overcome. Moving forward, and if we had more time, I'd want to get in there. There is a huge benefit, and it works out well, the concept of co-teaching. And my experience as a classroom teacher was in Series Unified. We had a co-teaching model to where I went into numerous classes, and as relationships developed and I was able to work with general education teachers on the needs of my students who were in the resource specialist program, we developed a co-teaching plan to where I still respected the content knowledge of the classroom teacher, especially in areas like math and science and some of the areas that I'm not overly strong in. And B, we relied on each other for me working with and helping to make their lessons more accessible. It was me who would be doing the questioning and calling on, I guess you could say, non-volunteers at this time and expanding the questioning. It was me who would emphasize to the teacher, hey, you know what, that may need to be re-emphasized. Or I would say, so-and-so, Mr. Callegos, Ms. Crivelli, I mean, these are names of May Hensley Junior High. Let me re-emphasize it. And it got better, actually, as time went on. But it really, it allowed the children to succeed at a level that they would have never, ever succeeded had we not have that mutual respect and rapport. And as a result, I mean, the kids on my caseload achieved, and they achieved in the classroom, and I know the general education teachers were appreciative. There's different styles there. I don't know if you could see that well. One teach, one support, alternative, parallel, team, station teaching. We have some good examples of this going on in our district. It's not as prevalent as I'd like. Elementary teachers do a good degree of push-in, especially in mathematics. I don't know if I'd call it co-teaching per se, but I think that it builds that relationship to where it makes it possible. And we've definitely had instances to where it has worked and still working at various places at the secondary level. So still more work to be done, but kudos to where it exists. With that, guys, I want to give you some final thoughts and just touch bases finally on your practicum. Culture takes time. In MCS especially, there's nothing that we can do in this district that is a quick move. I mean, we are. And that being said, though, I've got to admit I'm pretty darn proud of the work that's being done out there. There's been steady improvements on our indicators that demonstrate how our students are accessing general education. There has been willingness all over the district, and by willingness I mean grassroots of, hey, you know what, I want to do this, and they're doing it. We've got more kids with severe disabilities included into elective opportunities than have ever been the case. I'd love to put them in a general education science, just for the social aspect. We're not there yet, but we're getting close. I want to say all students deserve access, and that each individual educator plays a vital role in the lives of all of our students. I cannot stress teachers, classified staff, administrators. If we accepted the children into our classroom, worked on academic mentorship, support, acknowledgement, did not highlight their disability, did not make them feel bad for the areas that they were weak, either directly or indirectly, we would have kids that are so much more in tune with their learning, even if they're not at grade level or even well below grade level, because they would feel that they still have a chance. Things that you could do is highlight those areas of strength. Don't embarrass them on areas of weakness. Look for ways to call them out in a positive way rather than focusing on the ways that they have struggled in the past. And I guarantee you're going to see big changes in students with mild, moderate disabilities. And finally, success breeds success. When you have those great experiences, celebrate them, talk to your colleagues about them, and continue to push the envelope or take that one step further. With that, guys, that finishes my practice. Let's see what I did. 47 minutes and 53 seconds. Not too bad. Hopefully you're still awake. Now you're going to dig into that practicum. So as a reminder, you're going to read the attached article. You are going to write me a one-page reflection, double-space, 12-point font. The second page will simply be your reflection on this particular screencast, as well as your overall thoughts and reflections on inclusion. That could be for the better or for the worse. Please don't feel like you need to tell me something, that it doesn't true. You could take a stance at the reason why you don't think inclusion is the right way to go. I'm just anxious to read what you have on your mind. In any event, I appreciate your time. I hope that you guys have a great summer. I hope that this either, hopefully it gave you a better idea of District Goal 1.6 and some of the things regarding students with or some pertinent items regarding students with disabilities. Other than that, I look forward to reading your guys' practicum. Have a great summer.